The massive obsidian doors of the grand hall slammed shut, sealing Lyra inside a nightmare made of polished marble and suffocating silence. She stood completely alone in the center of the royal dais, her snow-white hair trembling against the thin fabric of her simple linen dress. 1,000 glittering eyes from the high aristocracy bore down upon her, their collective disgust sharp enough to draw blood. She looked up, her chocolate brown eyes searching desperately for a single shred of warmth in the man she was fated to love. But King Kaelum looked down at her from his towering throne with nothing but cold, unyielding arrogance. He did not see a devoted mate. He only saw a fragile, politically useless Omega from the lower districts. His deep voice echoed through the cavernous hall, shattering her fragile heart into a million irreparable pieces. He declared that a kingdom on the brink of war required a queen forged in power and wealthy alliances, not a weak, penniless. He turned his broad shoulders away from her, extending his hand to Lady Vespera, a highborn noble dripping in stolen diamonds and cruel ambition. The court erupted into deafening cheers for their new royal union, completely drowning out the quiet, agonizing sound of Lyra's soul breaking. Stripped of her dignity and cast out into the freezing night, Lyra ran. She ran until her lungs burned and the golden lights of the capital faded into utter darkness. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The freezing wind of the lower districts howled through the narrow, twisting alleyways carrying the bitter scent of rotting cabbage and damp coal. Lyra pulled her threadbare wool cloak tighter around her trembling shoulders, her snow-white hair tucked securely beneath a stained canvas hood. She was no longer the naive girl who had stood in the grand hall waiting for a fairy tale ending. The slums were a brutal, unforgiving teacher, and in the 3 weeks since her banishment, she had learned the absolute most important lesson of survival. Hope was a useless, heavy luxury, but observation was a lethal weapon. She refused to let her breaking heart drag her down into the cold, muddy gutters where the forgotten Omegas perished. She stood in the shadows of a crumbling brick archway, her chocolate brown eyes scanning the chaotic morning market of the Iron Ward. Merchants shouted in rough, desperate voices, their breath pluming in the freezing air as they tried to sell meager rations of root vegetables and bruised apples. The royal tax collectors, bloated and arrogant in their thick velvet coats, stalked through the muddy streets demanding heavy silver coins from people who barely had enough copper to buy bread. Lyra watched them with a cold, calculating precision. She did not feel the biting frost seeping through her worn leather boots. Her brilliant mind was completely absorbed in the invisible flowing currents of supply and demand. She saw the hidden mathematics in the chaos. She noticed a severe bottleneck near the eastern market gate. A heavy transport wagon belonging to a gruff, heavily scarred beta merchant was bogged down in the thick mud. His wagon was loaded to the brim with rough spun wool and raw iron ore, but he was completely trapped behind a long line of slow-moving grain carts waiting for royal inspection. Lyra watched his frustrated, frantic pacing. She calculated the rate of the tax collectors, the sheer weight of his loaded carts, and the rapidly approaching evening curfew. If he did not clear the heavily guarded gate within the hour, he would be forced to pay a massive overnight storage fee. It was a crippling fine that would completely wipe out his entire profit margin for the month, leaving him ruined. Lyra stepped out of the cold shadows and approached the angry merchant. Her small, fragile frame was entirely dwarfed by the massive wooden wheels of his transport wagon. The merchant glared down at her, telling her to scram and waving his heavy calloused hand in a rude dismissal. But Lyra did not flinch or cower. She kept her voice steady and low, entirely empty of the trembling fear she had once carried. She told him that she knew exactly how he could bypass the royal bottleneck and sell his entire shipment before the midday bells rang. The merchant paused, a harsh, mocking laugh escaping his cracked lips. He asked why a filthy street rat would possibly know anything about heavy commercial logistics. Lyra looked directly into his tired, bloodshot eyes. She did not offer a desperate plea or ask for charity. She offered a cold mathematical transaction. She explained that the southern service gate, primarily used for hauling away city refuse, was completely unguarded during the morning shift change. It was a narrow, treacherous route, but if he unhitched his 2 lead draft horses and used a specific pulley system around the sharpest corner, his wagon would clear the heavy stone gate with 3 inches to spare on either side. She drew a rapid, precise diagram in the wet mud, with a broken twig detailing the exact angle of approach and the specific tension ratio required to pull the heavy load through the tight alleyway. The merchant stared at the flawless geometrical lines scratched into the dirt, his jaw slowly dropping in absolute sheer disbelief. He looked back up at the fragile, striking Omega standing before him, realizing that beneath the grime and the torn canvas hood hid an intellect far sharper than any physical blade. He swallowed hard, the arrogance completely draining from his rough, exhausted voice. He asked her what she wanted in return for this brilliant, unseen escape route. Lyra did not hesitate for a single second. She demanded a 10% cut of his total profit from the raw iron ore paid immediately in solid silver, along with the keys to the abandoned storage loft above his horse stables. It was a steep, audacious demand, but she knew the exact undeniable value of her mind. The merchant agreed, sealing the contract with a firm, dirty handshake. 2 hours later, Lyra sat on the dusty wooden floor of her new private loft, the heavy silver coins clinking softly in her bruised palms. The space was small, smelling strongly of old hay and damp wood, but it was hers. She looked out the small, cracked window at the sprawling, chaotic slums below. The royal court had thrown her away because she possessed no armies and no vast ancestral wealth. But as she began to mentally map the intricate hidden trade routes of the entire capital city, a terrifying, beautiful realization washed over her completely. She did not need an Alpha King to protect her. She was going to slowly, meticulously buy his entire kingdom out from under him, starting with the very dirt beneath his arrogant feet. The dusty loft above the stables quickly transformed from a mere sanctuary into the strategic heart of a growing shadow operation. Lyra spent her nights hunched over a flickering tallow candle, her nimble fingers flying across stolen scraps of parchment. The walls of her small room became a chaotic tapestry of charcoal maps, intersecting timelines and complex mathematical formulas. She watched the capital city not as a terrified outcast, but as a master architect observing a deeply flawed machine. The lifeblood of the kingdom was trade, but that blood was being ruthlessly choked by the bloated, corrupt royal tax collectors. These arrogant lords appointed by King Kaelum to fund his endless border skirmishes drained the small merchants of every copper coin. Farmers from the outer valleys were abandoning their crops because the royal gate tolls cost more than the seasonal harvest itself. The lower districts were slowly starving, while the high nobility feasted on imported delicacies. Lyra saw the agonizing desperation in the hollow eyes of the street vendors, and she recognized the exact same vulnerability she had felt on the night of her banishment, but she also saw the massive glaring blind spots in the royal logistics. The tax collectors operated on laziness and predictable routine. They manned the wide main cobbled avenues during daylight hours, completely ignoring the treacherous winding river tributaries and the narrow subterranean maintenance tunnels that crisscrossed beneath the capital. Lyra began to meticulously orchestrate a secondary economy operating entirely in the unseen shadows. She started small, recruiting a tight-knit group of desperate riverboatmen and heavily indebted wagon drivers who had nothing left to lose. She did not lead them with soaring emotional speeches or promises of magical salvation. She earned their absolute loyalty through pure, undeniable results. She handed them strictly timed schedules calculated down to the very minute. She mapped the lunar cycles against the river tides, determining the exact moments when the water levels were high enough for heavy barges to slip silently past the lowered iron grates of the western sluice gates. She timed the sluggish, drunken shift changes of the royal guard with absolute perfection, synchronizing the movement of heavy grain carts with the precise moments when the tall stone watchtowers were left empty. It was a beautiful, breathtaking symphony of logistical precision. Under her quiet command, heavy shipments of vital winter wheat, dried meats, and raw textiles flowed through the city completely undetected. Carts rolled slowly through the dark, foggy streets on heavy wooden wheels wrapped in thick layers of spun wool to completely muffle the sound. Barges glided over the black river waters, carrying massive payloads of untaxed goods directly into the starving heart of the lower district. The merchants who followed her flawless blueprints suddenly found themselves turning massive profits, keeping their hard-earned silver entirely out of the greasy hands of the royal court. Word of the anonymous, brilliant architect began to spread through the underground like a quiet, powerful wildfire. They called her the Silver Merchant, a whispered title that commanded more genuine respect in the slums than the Alpha King himself. Within 6 months, the sheer volume of her shadow trade outgrew the small stable loft. The influx of resources required a massive centralized hub. Using an intricate web of proxy buyers and shell companies, Lyra purchased a massive, abandoned textile mill sitting on the desolate edge of the river district. The building was a towering, cavernous structure of crumbling red brick and heavy oxidized iron beams, long forgotten by the wealthy aristocracy. On the night the final heavy deed was signed, Lyra walked into the massive, empty warehouse entirely alone. The moonlight poured through the shattered skylights, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty concrete floor. She stood in the very center of the sprawling space, her breath pluming in the cold night air. The sheer scale of the building was staggering, easily large enough to house thousands of tons of grain and steel. She closed her chocolate brown eyes, listening to the quiet dripping of the river water against the wooden docks outside. For her entire life, she had been told that an Omega possessed no inherent value without the protective claiming mark of a powerful Alpha. She had been taught to keep her head down, to speak softly, and to blend invisibly into the background. But standing in the heart of her newly acquired domain, she finally recognized the true terrifying magnitude of her hidden gift. Her brilliant mind was an unstoppable force of nature, capable of completely manipulating the grand fate of the kingdom without ever lifting a physical sword. She opened her eyes, her vision perfectly clear, and her heart beating with a steady, unyielding rhythm. The royal court had thrown her into the freezing mud, expecting her to quietly wither away and die. Instead, she was meticulously building an unbreakable economic empire in the dark. She would fill this massive empty warehouse with the essential lifeblood of the realm, actively controlling the food, the steel, and the entire future of the continent. And when the desperate time finally came, she would make the arrogant Alpha King realize exactly what he had so callously thrown away. The freezing rain battered against the high-shattered skylights of the massive textile mill, echoing through the cavernous space like a relentless drumbeat. Because Lyra sat alone at a heavy oak desk she had salvaged from a ruined merchant estate surrounded by towering stacks of leather-bound ledgers and thick rolls of... She dipped her quill into a small glass pot of black ink, carefully adjusting the supply chain projections for the upcoming harsh winter. But as a sudden violent crack of thunder rattled the heavy iron beams above her hand violently jerked, leaving a sharp jagged line of dark ink across the pristine white parchment. The harsh sudden sound instantly shattered her quiet focus, dragging her brilliant mind ruthlessly back into the dark agonizing abyss of her deepest trauma. She closed her chocolate brown eyes, her breathing suddenly turning shallow and highly erratic. She was no longer sitting in the secure safety of her heavily fortified warehouse. She was violently thrown back to the exact night of her banishment. The bitter biting cold of that night was a physical living entity that had brutally seeped into her very bones. After King Kaelum had publicly humiliated her and chosen Lady Vespera, the royal guards had forcefully dragged Lyra to the towering iron gates of the capital city and thrown her out into the freezing torrential rain. She vividly remembered the terrifying deafening sound of those massive iron gates slamming shut behind her, a heavy metallic boom that finalized her absolute total erasure from the world she had known. She had wandered blindly through the pitch-black sprawling slums, her thin linen dress completely soaked and clinging heavily to her shivering, fragile frame. The lower districts were a terrifying, chaotic nightmare of desperate, starving people and ruthless, violent predators hiding in the deep shadows. Every sudden noise in the dark alleyways, every distant shout or clattering stone had caused her heart to violently slam against her ribs in pure primal terror. She remembered collapsing into a cold, muddy alleyway, her knees scraping painfully against the sharp, jagged cobblestones. She had curled into a tight, trembling ball, burying her tear-streaked face into her frozen hands. In that agonizing, suffocating darkness, she had desperately prayed for Kaelum to realize his monumental mistake. She had naively prayed for the powerful Alpha King to ride through the heavy iron gates on his massive warhorse and pull her safely up into his strong, protective arms. She had waited for agonizing hours, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing rain slowly turned into a harsh, biting sleet. But the towering stone walls of the capital city remained completely silent, and Kaelum never came. The agonizing memory of his cold, unyielding eyes looking down at her from the towering obsidian throne flashed violently through her mind. It was a look of pure, calculated dismissal. He had evaluated her worth entirely based on her lack of wealthy aristocratic lineage and deemed her fundamentally useless. That profound, crushing realization had been far more painful than the freezing wind or the sharp, jagged stones cutting into her skin. It was the absolute terrifying realization that love and loyalty were completely meaningless illusions in a world governed entirely by brutal physical power and strategic political wealth. Lyra violently opened her eyes, forcing the dark, suffocating memories back into the locked iron vault of her mind. She stared down at the jagged ink stain, ruining the perfect mathematical column of her trade ledger. She let out a long, slow breath, forcing her racing heartbeat to steady and match the quiet, rhythmic dripping of the rain outside. She refused to be that helpless, terrified girl sobbing in the freezing mud ever again. She reached out and deliberately ripped the ruined parchment from the heavy leather ledger, tossing it into the small iron stove burning in the corner of the large room. She watched the paper curl and blacken in the bright orange flames, completely consumed by the intense heat. She picked up a fresh sheet of thick parchment and dipped her quill back into the dark ink. As she began to rewrite the complex trade routes, her jaw set with absolute unyielding determination. She made a quiet, permanent vow to herself in the empty, cavernous warehouse. She would never again entrust her safety, her heart, or her survival to the fleeting, arrogant whims of an alpha. She would not build her future on the fragile illusion of romantic protection. She would build her impenetrable fortress out of raw, undeniable numbers, heavy ironclad contracts, and absolute total economic control. The royal court had weaponized her poverty to completely destroy her, but she was going to weaponize her wealth to entirely rewrite the fundamental laws of the continent. She finished the final complex calculation, sealing the massive trade agreement with a firm stroke of black ink, entirely unaware that hundreds of miles away, the arrogant king who had broken her heart was about to face a terrifying threat his massive armies could never defeat. Heavy gray clouds hung over the capital city, casting a dark shadow across the obsidian keep. King Kaelum stood alone on the high marble balcony, his broad muscular hands gripping the freezing stone balustrade. He looked down not at a thriving kingdom, but at a rapidly dying. The sprawling cobblestone markets below were entirely empty, devoid of the usual chaotic noise of merchants and lively trade. The smoke rising from the scattered chimneys was thin and desperate, a clear sign that citizens were burning their own furniture to survive the bitter cold. A hostile northern coalition had blockaded the mountain passes and poisoned the eastern river tributaries, cutting the capital off from the rest of the continent. No fresh grain or clean water had entered the city gates in 2 agonizing months. Kaelum felt a massive, suffocating weight pressing down upon his broad shoulders. He was an alpha king bred for brutal battlefields and complex tactical warfare. He knew how to lead a massive cavalry charge and effortlessly crush an enemy shield wall using sheer physical dominance. But standing before a creeping silent famine, his immense physical strength was fundamentally useless. He could not strike down widespread hunger with a heavy broadsword. He could not aggressively intimidate the empty stone silos into producing winter wheat. For the first time in his violent life, the powerful Alpha King felt profoundly, terrifyingly helpless. The realization clawed at his chest, a dark, heavy beast of failure that he could not conquer. The sudden, sharp sound of heavy footsteps and rustling silk violently broke his solitary thoughts. Lady Vespera, his high-born mate, stepped onto the freezing balcony draped in thick crimson velvet and heavy, sparkling diamonds. She looked completely untouched by the immense suffering happening just beyond the palace walls. Her father, Lord Valerius, trailed closely behind her, his pale face flushed with arrogant, demanding annoyance. They did not look out at the starving, crumbling city below. They only saw the minor, frustrating inconveniences to their own luxurious, sheltered lifestyle. Vespera crossed her arms, complaining in a sharp, high-pitched voice that echoed gratingly against the cold stone. She whined that the royal palace kitchens had completely run out of imported sweet wines and the delicate white flour required for her elaborate morning pastries. She demanded that Kaelum immediately send the royal vanguard to violently break the northern blockade and secure her missing luxuries. Kaelum slowly turned his head to look at her, a deep, sickening wave of profound disgust washing over his tired soul. 3 years ago, he had publicly chosen her for her powerful aristocratic bloodline, falsely believing her wealthy family would secure his fragile borders. But in the face of a true existential crisis, she was nothing but an empty, hollow shell of blinding vanity, offering absolutely no real strategic value. He told her in a low, dangerous rumble that the elite royal vanguard was starving just like the desperate common people in the lower districts. He calmly explained that if he marched an army of exhausted, malnourished men into the heavily fortified mountain passes, it would be a senseless, bloody massacre. Lord Valerius sneered loudly, insisting that true alpha warriors did not need full bellies to conquer inferior, weaker enemies. The corrupt lord argued that the king was showing fatal, pathetic weakness by not attacking the northern coalition immediately. Kaelum stared at the arrogant nobleman, realizing with absolute terrifying clarity the monumental, catastrophic mistake he had made on the night of his mating ceremony. He had purposefully surrounded himself with ambitious, arrogant parasites who possessed absolutely no logistical substance. He turned his face back toward the gray, unforgiving horizon, his chest tight with deep, agonizing regret. He suddenly vividly remembered a quiet, snow-white-haired Omega he had callously banished into the freezing mud. He remembered the sharp, intelligent spark in her chocolate-brown eyes, a spark he had completely ignored in favor of heavy, stolen diamonds. He forced the painful memory down, the heavy guilt burning like pure acid in his throat. He could not afford to drown in the past when his present reality was rapidly crumbling into dust. His kingdom desperately needed a logistical miracle, not another bloody, destructive war. The heavy wooden doors of the royal study suddenly burst open instantly, shattering the tense, heavy silence. The commander of the royal guard marched onto the balcony, his dark armor covered in thick mud, and his face extremely grim. He was supporting a breathless, exhausted scout who had just ridden continuously for 3 days and 3 nights from the far outer territories. The young scout collapsed to his bruised knees on the polished marble floor, violently gasping for cold air. Kaelum immediately stepped forward, his dark eyes intense, demanding the urgent news from the southern trade routes. The scout looked up, his eyes wide with a chaotic mixture of pure terror and desperate, fragile hope. He rapidly reported that the southern routes were completely barren, but there was a massive, unexplainable anomaly in the independent trade city of Oakhaven. An anonymous, highly secretive merchant syndicate had somehow flawlessly bypassed the northern blockades entirely. They had meticulously stockpiled thousands of tons of winter wheat, dried meats, and clean water in massive heavy iron silos. The syndicate was commanded by a single ruthless, anonymous mogul known only across the continent as the Silver Merchant. Vespera scoffed loudly, waving her hand in complete arrogant dismissal. She demanded that Kaelum simply send the remaining army to aggressively seize the independent city and take the hoarded grain by absolute brute force. The exhausted scout trembled violently, shaking his head in rapid, desperate denial. He explained that the Silver Merchant controlled an elite mercenary army 10 times the size of the Royal Guard, and the sprawling trade city was heavily fortified with advanced siege weapons. The only possible way to secure the life-saving grain was to meet the mysterious mogul in person and accept their strict, uncompromising terms. Kaelum stared down at the trembling scout, the heavy, crushing reality of his total failure finally settling deep into his aching bones. The powerful, invincible Alpha King had absolutely no strategic leverage, no military might, and no violent options left. He realized with dark, sickening dread that he must travel to the edge of the continent, strip away his royal pride, and desperately beg an anonymous merchant for the survival of his dying kingdom. The grueling journey across the barren wasteland took 5 agonizing days. King Kaelum rode at the head of a small contingent of his most elite guards, leaving behind the crumbling marble spires of his dying capital. The landscape they traversed was a bleak, terrifying reflection of his own monumental failures. The once fertile southern plains were now frozen, cracked earth, completely stripped of any life or hope. The freezing wind bit through his heavy wool riding cloak, a constant, bitter reminder of the creeping death slowly strangling his people. He did not ride in a luxurious enclosed carriage draped in. He rode on horseback, feeling the agonizing exhaustion radiating from his loyal men and the desperate hunger gnawing deeply at his own massive frame. For the first time in his entire life, the powerful Alpha King was not marching toward a glorious, bloody battlefield to violently conquer a weaker enemy. He was marching toward a complete, total surrender of his royal pride. He was traveling to the independent trade city of Oakhaven to beg a completely anonymous merchant for the very survival of his crumbling realm. As the exhausted royal procession crested the final steep rocky ridge, the dark gray clouds suddenly broke, revealing the sprawling valley below. Kaelum violently pulled back on his heavy leather reins, forcing his massive warhorse to a sudden halt. His dark eyes widened in absolute sheer disbelief. He had expected Oakhaven to be a chaotic, dirty settlement of greedy smugglers and crude thieves. Instead, he was looking down at an absolute masterpiece of flawless human engineering and logistical perfection. The city was a sprawling, massive fortress, built not of fragile decorative marble, but of unyielding, dark steel and heavy reinforced brick. Perfectly paved, wide cobblestone avenues intersected with flawless mathematical precision, completely free of the freezing, muddy ruts that plagued his own capital. Towering, massive iron silos stood in perfectly aligned rows, casting long, intimidating shadows across the bustling valley. They were architectural titans holding thousands of tons of life-saving grain entirely untouched by the devastating famine ravaging the rest of the continent. Kaelum slowly urged his horse down the steep, winding path, his heart hammering a heavy, chaotic rhythm against his broad chest. As they approached the towering main gates of the trade city, the sheer magnitude of the Silver Merchant's empire became terrifyingly clear. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, warm bread, and burning clean coal, a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the rotting cabbage and despair of his own. Massive, heavy transport wagons rolled seamlessly through the wide gates, completely unhindered by corrupt tax collectors or chaotic bottlenecks. The guards manning the heavy iron portcullis were not undisciplined thugs. They were a highly trained elite mercenary force clad in uniform dark steel armor, their sharp eyes scanning the incoming traffic with cold, calculating precision. They moved with a synchronized, flawless discipline that easily rivaled Kaelum's own elite royal vanguard. When the king of the realm approached the heavy iron gates, expecting the traditional blare of royal trumpets and immediate subservient bowing, he was met with total cold indifference. A heavily scarred mercenary captain stepped forward, raising a single calloused hand to halt the royal procession. He did not drop to his knees or tremble in the presence of the massive Alpha King. He simply held out a heavy wooden ledger, his voice completely devoid of any awe or fear. He calmly demanded to know the nature of their business and their scheduled appointment time. Kaelum felt a sudden hot flash of deeply ingrained Alpha pride flare in his chest, but he violently forced it down, swallowing the bitter metallic taste of complete humiliation. He was a king without a crown in this sprawling iron empire. He stated his name and his desperate royal title, requesting an immediate, urgent audience with the Silver Merchant to negotiate a massive grain purchase for his starving people. The mercenary captain did not bat an eye. He coldly checked the heavy ledger, noting the lack of a scheduled appointment, before gesturing for the royal guards to surrender their heavy broadswords. It was an unprecedented, terrifying insult to an Alpha King to be disarmed, but Kaelum gave the silent, agonizing order. He unbuckled his heavy steel belt, handing his ancient ancestral sword over to the captain without a single word of protest. He was entirely at the mercy of this anonymous mogul. They were escorted on foot through the sprawling, bustling heart of Oakhaven. Kaelum looked around in profound silent awe. He saw betas and omegas working side by side, with alphas completely stripped of the toxic, rigid social hierarchy that choked his own kingdom. Here, intellect, hard work, and logistical brilliance were clearly the only currencies that truly mattered. The royal procession was led to a towering central building made of dark polished stone and heavy iron beams, the beating heart of the massive trade empire. They were escorted up a wide sweeping staircase and told to wait in a grand antechamber completely devoid of fragile decorative art, but rich in raw, undeniable power. Huge maps of the continent covered the walls, detailed with intricate trade routes and supply chain logistics that Kaelum could not even begin to comprehend. He stood in the center of the quiet room, his massive broad shoulders tense, his callous hands trembling slightly at his sides. He had spent his entire life valuing brutal physical dominance and aristocratic bloodlines, entirely dismissing the quiet, unseen power of commerce and intellect. Now that exact unseen power was the only thing standing between his kingdom and total annihilation. The heavy, reinforced oak doors at the far end of the grand antechamber suddenly let out a deep, echoing, metallic groan. Kaelum held his breath, his dark eyes locked on the slowly opening doors, completely unprepared for the terrifying, beautiful ghost that was about to step out of the shadows and fundamentally shatter his entire world. The heavy, reinforced oak doors swung inward, revealing a cavernous counting room bathed in the harsh golden light of a dozen crystal chandeliers. King Kaelum stepped slowly across the threshold, his massive boots echoing heavily against the polished black marble floor. The room was a sprawling nerve center of absolute economic dominance. Dozens of clerks bent over long wooden tables, rapidly scratching complex calculations into thick leather-bound ledgers, completely ignoring the arrival of the powerful Alpha King. At the very far end of the massive room stood a large, beautifully carved mahogany desk. Behind it, a slender figure stood facing the massive arch windows, looking out over the bustling iron silos of Oakhaven. The silver merchant was draped in a perfectly tailored coat of dark midnight wool, accented with heavy silver clasps that practically radiated unyielding authority. Kaelum stopped in the exact center of the room, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared to desperately beg for the lives of his starving people. He lowered his broad shoulders, swallowing his deeply ingrained royal pride, and began to speak, addressing the anonymous mogul with a heavy, desperate reverence he had never used before. But before the first syllable of his desperate plea could fully leave his dry lips, the powerful merchant slowly turned around. The breath was instantly violently ripped from Kaelum's lungs. He stumbled back a half step, his dark eyes expanding in absolute, sheer, terrifying disbelief. The world around him completely stopped spinning, the chaotic noise of the busy clerks fading into a deafening, roaring silence in his ears. Standing before him, completely bathed in the golden afternoon light, was not a grizzled, battle-hardened mercenary or a ruthless ancient aristocrat. It was a face he had desperately tried to banish to the darkest, deepest corners of his guilty mind. The striking snow-white hair fell in perfect, flawless waves across her shoulders, no longer hidden beneath a filthy canvas hood, but gleaming like spun silver. Her chocolate brown eyes locked onto his, not with the desperate, trembling terror he vividly remembered, but with the cold, calculating precision of a master architect observing a fundamentally flawed structure. It was Lyra, the fragile, penniless omega he had so callously thrown into the freezing mud 3 years ago, was the omnipotent silver merchant. Lyra stood perfectly still behind the heavy mahogany desk, feeling absolutely no sudden spike of panic or fear. She had known for exactly 5 days that the desperate king was marching toward her city. Her vast intelligence network had tracked his pathetic, starving procession from the very moment he left his crumbling capital. She looked at the massive, powerful Alpha King standing completely paralyzed in her counting room. 3 years ago, the mere sight of his broad shoulders and intense dark eyes would have sent her fragile heart into a frantic, hopeful flutter. Now she felt nothing but a cold, profound sense of absolute control. She saw the heavy dark circles under his eyes, the hollow sunken line of his usually sharp jaw, and the desperate, frantic vulnerability radiating from his massive frame. He was completely broken, begging at the feet of the exact same woman he had arrogantly deemed entirely worthless. Kaelum opened his mouth, his lips moving silently, as his fractured mind desperately tried to comprehend the impossible reality standing before him. He finally managed to choke out her name, his deep, rough voice cracking with a chaotic mixture of profound awe, agonizing guilt, and pure desperation. He took a hesitant, shaky step forward, his large, calloused hands reaching out instinctively as if trying to grasp a terrifying, beautiful ghost. But Lyra did not flinch or take a single step backward. She did not offer him a warm, forgiving smile or run into his massive arms. She calmly raised a single perfectly manicured hand, completely stopping the invincible Alpha King dead in his tracks with a single effortless gesture. She spoke, her voice slicing through the heavy, tense silence of the cavernous room like a perfectly sharpened blade of pure ice. She did not address him with the subservient, trembling tone of a forgotten mate. She addressed him with the cold, detached professionalism of a supreme ruler evaluating a desperate, pathetic beggar. She welcomed King Kaelum to Oakhaven, her tone completely devoid of any royal reverence. She stated clearly that she was a very busy woman with a massive continent to feed and demanded to know exactly why he had dragged his starving, exhausted guards across the freezing wastelands to interrupt her daily ledgers. Kaelum stared at her, completely mesmerized by the sheer, undeniable magnitude of her presence. She was entirely unrecognizable from the weeping, broken girl in the Grand Hall. She was radiating a terrifying, breathtaking power that had absolutely nothing to do with alpha strength or ancient aristocratic bloodlines. You're listening to this story on the Alpha King Secrets channel. Are you enjoying today's story? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's get back to the story. It was the pure, unyielding power of a brilliant mind that had conquered the world while he had been slowly destroying it. He felt a deep, agonizing physical pain tear through his chest as the monumental, catastrophic weight of his past mistake finally crushed him completely. He had thrown away a peerless visionary queen to marry a useless, empty crown. He fell to his bruised knees on the cold, black marble floor, completely abandoning the last fragile shreds of his toxic alpha pride. He looked up into her cold, chocolate brown eyes, his voice trembling with raw, desperate agony. He begged her for mercy, not for himself, but for the thousands of innocent, starving people trapped behind his crumbling walls. He offered her anything she wanted, demanding she name her ultimate price for the life-saving grain. Lyra looked down at the powerful king kneeling willingly at her feet, her brilliant mind rapidly calculating the final devastating phase of her master plan. She slowly walked around the heavy mahogany desk, the silver metal heels of her boots clicking sharply against the polished stone. She stopped just inches from his kneeling form, looking down at him with absolute, unyielding dominance. She told him that she would save his dying kingdom, but her salvation would not be purchased with his useless royal silver or his empty romantic apologies. She leaned down, her voice a dangerous, chilling whisper, promising that he was going to pay a price far heavier than he could possibly imagine. Lyra stood perfectly still, letting the terrifying weight of her cold whisper settle completely over the kneeling king. She did not raise her voice or throw chaotic emotional accusations. She operated with the chilling, calculated precision of a master architect finalizing a brutal contract. She slowly stepped back from his massive kneeling form, returning to her heavy mahogany desk. She picked up a thick, leather-bound ledger, heavily stamped with the royal crest of his crumbling capital. She opened it, tossing it onto the edge of the desk, so Kaelum could clearly see the chaotic, desperate numbers. She told him that his kingdom was not just starving, it was completely bankrupt. The corrupt aristocratic families he had so eagerly allied with had systematically drained the royal treasury to fund their luxurious protected estates, leaving the common people to slowly freeze and die in the lower districts. Kaelum stared at the damning ledger, the agonizing truth hitting him like a heavy iron hammer. He could not argue or defend his royal honor because the absolute flawless mathematics of her intelligence network proved his monumental failure perfectly. He slowly rose to his feet, his broad muscular shoulders slumped, his dark eyes entirely hollow with profound, crushing regret. He looked at the brilliant, beautiful woman standing before him, realizing with sickening clarity that she possessed a fundamental, undeniable understanding of his own kingdom that he had completely ignored for 3 agonizing years. He asked her in a low, rough whisper, completely stripped of his former arrogant alpha authority, what her exact price would be to release the life-saving grain to his dying people. Lyra did not hesitate. Her mind had meticulously planned this precise negotiation for months, calculating every possible variable and royal reaction. She leaned forward, her chocolate brown eyes entirely devoid of any soft, forgiving warmth. She demanded a complete, immediate, and permanent transfer of all southern trade routes and agricultural lands directly into her private ownership. She demanded that the corrupt aristocratic families, specifically Lady Vespera's entirely useless bloodline, be completely stripped of their inherited tax collection rights. She demanded that her own private elite mercenary force be granted absolute unrestricted access to the capital city to personally oversee the distribution of the grain, ensuring that not a single corrupt royal lord could hoard the resources for their own survival. Kaelum flinched as each harsh, uncompromising demand struck him. She was not just asking for exorbitant wealth, she was systematically, ruthlessly dismantling the entire foundational power structure of his kingdom. She was entirely removing the protective fangs from the corrupt nobility and placing the absolute, undeniable control of the realm directly into her own calloused hands. A small dying ember of his deeply ingrained royal pride sparked in his chest, screaming at him to violently reject these humiliating terms. But he looked out the massive arched window at the sprawling iron silos of Oakhaven, realizing he had absolutely no— He was a starving, desperate beggar negotiating with an omnipotent, flawless god of commerce. He slowly nodded his head, accepting every single devastating term, without a single word of protest. Lyra watched his complete total submission, feeling a strange, cold satisfaction settling in her chest. She had finally achieved the absolute economic dominance she had dreamed of, while shivering in the freezing mud. But as she looked at his deeply agonizing regret, a tiny, unexpected fracture appeared in her impenetrable iron walls. She quickly, ruthlessly shut it down, pushing a heavy parchment contract across the desk. She instructed him to sign the document in blood, finalizing the complete transfer of power. Kaelum did not hesitate. He drew a small silver dagger from his boot, slicing a deep, clean line across his broad palm and firmly pressing his bloody handprint onto the heavy parchment. The kingdom officially belonged to the silver merchant. Lyra coldly informed him that the massive grain shipments would depart at dawn, but he would not be returning to the capital. She commanded the invincible Alpha King to remain in Oakhaven for the next week, strictly as her personal logistical hostage, ensuring the corrupt royal vanguard did not attempt any violent retaliation during the delicate distribution process. Kaelum simply nodded again, completely accepting his profound humiliation. He was escorted out of the grand counting room by her elite mercenaries, leaving Lyra entirely alone. She stared down at the heavy parchment contract, the bloody handprint stark against the white paper. She had mathematically flawlessly won the ultimate war, but as she touched the rough-dried edge of his blood, a sudden, sharp, completely illogical ache bloomed deep in her protected chest. The flawless cold mathematics of revenge were perfectly balanced, but the slow, agonizing burn of their shared undeniable history had only just begun to truly ignite. For the next 3 days, King Kaelum existed as a silent ghost within the sprawling iron fortress of Oakhaven. Stripped of his heavy royal armor and his booming authoritative commands, he was granted restricted movement through the lower administrative levels of the Grand Counting House, always shadowed by 2 heavily armed elite mercenaries. He did not attempt to escape or demand better treatment from his captors. Instead, he found himself entirely captivated by the mesmerizing rhythmic flow of Lyra's massive trade empire. He stood in the cold shadows of the high-arched hallways, watching her command the bustling city below. She did not rule with the violent booming shouts or brutal physical intimidation he had always relied upon to maintain his fragile borders. She ruled with a quiet, absolute precision. He watched in profound awe as she seamlessly directed large teams of beta foremen and omega accountants, treating them not as disposable subservient citizens, but as highly valued intellectual peers. She knew the exact structural capacity of every towering iron silo, the precise mathematical gradient of the eastern river currents, and the names of the exhausted dock workers who hauled the heavy grain sacks through the freezing rain. Kaelum realized with a deep, agonizing physical ache that she possessed a genuine, profound empathy, perfectly balanced by a terrifying, ruthless intellect. He thought of Lady Vespera back in the crumbling capital, demanding sweet wines and delicate pastries while the lower districts starved. He had spent his entire life conquering external borders, completely blind to the fact that true supreme power was built from the ground up through shared labor, undeniable respect, and brilliant logistical foresight. On the 4th evening, the chaotic noise of the grand counting room finally faded as the massive administrative shifts changed. The heavy reinforced oak doors clicked shut, leaving only a few flickering tallow candles casting long golden shadows across the polished black marble floor. Lyra remained alone at her heavy mahogany desk, her striking snow-white hair pinned back tightly as she leaned over a massive complex ledger detailing the secondary supply lines to the dying capital. Her chocolate brown eyes were narrowed in intense, focused concentration, the scratch of her quill, the only sound in the cavernous space. Kaelum slowly stepped out of the dark shadows, quietly dismissing his mercenary guards with a subtle deferential tilt of his head. The guards looked to Lyra, who gave a single short, barely perceptible nod, allowing them to withdraw into the outer corridor. The heavy, tense silence between them was thick and intoxicating, charged with the undeniable electric pull of a severed primal bond desperately trying to knit itself back together. Kaelum approached the heavy mahogany desk, his massive leather boots making almost no sound on the polished stone. He did not cross the physical boundary she had so clearly drawn, remaining on the opposite side of the thick wood, but he stopped close enough to smell the faint, sharp scent of black ink, heavy parchment, and her natural, intoxicating, sweet vanilla aroma. He looked down at the complex matrix of numbers and intersecting geographical lines spread across the heavy paper. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke. The arrogant Alpha King, who had once commanded massive, violent armies with a single thunderous roar, was entirely silenced by the sheer, brilliant complexity of her mind. He quietly asked a genuine logistical question about a dangerous bottleneck forming near the eastern river toll, pointing a heavy Kaelum's scarred finger at a specific column of bright red ink. Lyra paused, her sharp quill hovering just above the thick white parchment. She looked up, her chocolate brown eyes colliding violently with his intense dark gaze. She expected to see the mocking, arrogant dismissal she had suffered 3 years ago in the Grand Hall. Instead, she saw a man entirely stripped of his toxic royal pride, looking at her with a profound, raw reverence. He was not looking at her as a fragile, useless Omega he desired to violently conquer. He was looking at her as a peerless, intellectual equal he desperately needed to understand. She slowly lowered her quill, the cold, impenetrable iron walls around her protected heart trembling slightly under the intense heat of his genuine intellectual respect. She leaned forward, slightly explaining the complex mathematical workaround using the natural shifting lunar tides to bypass the shallow, treacherous river. As she spoke, her slender, elegant fingers traced the newly mapped trade route on the heavy paper. Kaelum leaned closer, his broad, muscular shoulder hovering just inches from hers. The physical proximity was suddenly overwhelmingly intoxicating. The deep primal instinct of the alpha screamed at his heavy chest, urging him to close the tiny distance, to pull her into his massive arms, and violently claim the brilliant, beautiful mate he had so foolishly discarded for a useless crown. He could see the faint, rapid pulse fluttering frantically at the base of her delicate throat, betraying the calm, cold professional facade she projected so flawlessly. The heavy, intoxicating heat radiating from his massive body washed over her, causing her breath to hitch audibly in the quiet, candlelit room. Lyra felt the undeniable, terrifying pull of the primal bond surging hot through her veins, violently warring with the cold, hard logic that had kept her alive in the freezing slums. She wanted to step back, to build a massive iron wall between them and completely sever the intoxicating, dangerous connection. But as Kaelum slowly lowered his gaze to her slightly parted lips, his dark eyes filled with a deep, agonizing sorrow and a desperate, burning hunger, she found herself entirely frozen in the shared gravitational pull of the moment. He did not push the boundary or try to forcefully take what he had thrown away. He simply stood there, a massive, towering mountain of restrained, lethal power, offering her the ultimate, absolute control over the shared space. He whispered her name, his deep, rough voice vibrating with a raw, heartbreaking vulnerability that completely shattered the quiet room, leaving her brilliant mind desperately struggling to calculate a defense against the one true thing she could not mathematically control. The intoxicating quiet of the counting room was suddenly violently shattered by the deafening crack of thunder. A massive, unnatural storm slammed into the sprawling valley of Oakhaven with terrifying, sudden ferocity. The high arched windows rattled dangerously under the heavy, punishing assault of freezing rain and howling wind. Lyra instantly snapped out of the heavy magnetic trance, pulling her chocolate brown eyes away from Kaelum's intense gaze. Her brilliant mind rapidly pivoted from the dangerous, intoxicating heat of their shared proximity to the cold, hard, logistical reality of her empire. A frantic, soaked foreman burst through the heavy oak doors, his voice rough and panicked. He shouted that the sudden violent river swell had snapped the primary mooring lines on the heavy western docks. 3 massive iron-reinforced transport barges, fully loaded with the final critical grain shipments destined for the starving capital, were tearing away from the wooden piers. If they broke completely loose, they would smash into the jagged stone breakwater and sink thousands of tons of life-saving food to the dark bottom of the river. Lyra did not hesitate or wait for her elite guards. She bolted past the stunned Alpha King, sprinting down the wide, sweeping staircase and throwing open the heavy iron fortress doors. The freezing torrential rain hit her like a wall of solid ice, instantly soaking her dark midnight wool coat and plastering her snow-white hair to her pale cheeks. She ran toward the chaotic western docks, the deafening roar of the raging river completely swallowing the frantic shouts of her terrified workers. The massive wooden pier was a slippery, treacherous nightmare. A dozen desperate Beta and Omega workers were screaming, straining with all their might against a thick, heavy hemp rope, desperately trying to winch the massive, violently bucking barge back to the iron cleats. But they lacked the sheer physical mass to hold the terrifying kinetic momentum of the enraged river. The heavy rope groaned dangerously, slipping inch by painful inch through their bleeding, calloused hands. Lyra lunged forward, grabbing the thick, freezing wet rope with her own bare hands, adding her fragile weight to the desperate struggle. She shouted rapid, precise mathematical commands, calculating the exact angle of leverage needed to bypass the violent current, but the physical force was simply too massive. Suddenly, a towering shadow eclipsed the harsh, flickering light of the dock lanterns. King Kaelum did not stand on the safe, dry balcony, barking useless, arrogant orders. He sprinted directly into the freezing torrential rain, completely abandoning the last remaining shreds of his royal. He grabbed the thick, heavy rope directly in front of Lyra, his massive, muscular back shielding her entirely from the biting, punishing wind. He did not violently yank the rope or try to forcefully overpower the raging river with blind alpha aggression. He braced his heavy leather boots against the slippery wooden planks and looked back over his massive shoulder, entirely submitting to her command. He roared over the deafening storm, demanding she tell him the exact angle of the pull. Lyra stared up at the completely soaked powerful king, realizing he was offering his immense brute strength not to dominate her, but to become the physical instrument of her brilliant mind. She shouted the precise mechanical instructions, ordering him to drop his center of gravity and pull at a sharp 45-degree angle, perfectly syncing his massive physical power with the natural rolling rhythm of the violent waves. Kaelum locked his heavy jaw, the thick muscles in his broad back and massive arms bulging. Terrifyingly under his soaked wool tunic, he became a living, unyielding anchor. With a deafening guttural roar, he pulled the heavy wet rope, completely overpowering the massive violent surge of the freezing river. Following her exact flawless timing, the exhausted workers managed to quickly loop the secondary iron chains around the heavy steel cleats, permanently securing the massive loaded barges. The terrifying crisis was instantly averted. The exhausted workers collapsed onto the wet wooden planks, gasping for freezing air, but Lyra remained standing completely frozen. Kaelum slowly turned to face her, his chest heaving violently, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His expensive royal clothes were ruined, covered in thick black dock grease and freezing mud. He looked exactly like the desperate common laborers he had spent his entire life ruling over. But as he looked down at her small trembling frame, he did not look humiliated or angry. His intense dark eyes burned with a profound raw respect that completely shattered the final remaining defenses around her heavily guarded heart. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, reaching out with a massive, bleeding, calloused hand to gently push a wet strand of snow, white hair, away from her freezing cheek. It was a gesture of pure, breathtaking reverence, proving he finally valued the brilliant, beautiful woman she truly was. But before the intoxicating heavy heat of their shared moment could fully ignite, a bloody, desperate scout on a collapsing warhorse violently crashed through the main gates of the dockyard, screaming a terrifying warning from the capital that would completely change the fate of the entire continent. The heavy freezing rain continued to batter the massive wooden docks as the exhausted scout slid from the saddle of his collapsing warhorse. His dark leather armor was violently torn and soaked thick with dark mud and the terrifying metallic scent of a desperate. He crashed onto the wet wooden planks, violently gasping for cold air, his terrified eyes darting wildly until they locked onto the towering frame of King Kaelum. The romantic heavy heat that had just blossomed beautifully between Lyra and the king was instantly violently shattered, replaced by the cold, brutal reality of a crumbling kingdom. Kaelum stepped away from Lyra, his broad shoulders instantly tensing as the deeply ingrained instincts of the alpha warriors surged rapidly back to the surface. He dropped to one single knee in the freezing mud, gripping the young scout's trembling shoulders and demanding the urgent military report with a sharp, commanding voice that echoed loudly over the roaring river. The scout coughed violently, his voice cracking painfully as he delivered the devastating treasonous news. He reported that the exact moment Kaelum had ridden out of the capital to seek the Grain Lord Valerius and the corrupt aristocratic families had immediately launched a violent coordinated coup. They had ruthlessly weaponized the creeping famine, twisting the public narrative to convince the starving, desperate citizens that the king had cowardly abandoned them to save himself. Lady Vespera had barricaded the towering obsidian keep, using her vast stolen wealth to bribe the remaining royal guards and mercenary factions within the capital walls. They were not waiting for the grain shipments to arrive. They were actively preparing to declare Kaelum a traitor the moment he stepped foot back inside the capital, executing him on sight and seizing absolute permanent control of the entire realm. The scout desperately warned that they had amassed a massive, heavily armored force specifically designed to slaughter Kaelum's small returning contingent in a brutal, unavoidable ambush. Lyra stood completely still in the freezing torrential rain, her chocolate brown eyes fixed intensely on the trembling scout. Her brilliant mind instantly shifted into overdrive, rapidly calculating the complex political variables and the terrifying military odds. She saw the flawless mathematical trap Lord Valerius had set. It was a classic, predictable, aristocratic maneuver entirely devoid of genuine strategic genius, but highly effective, relying purely on brute physical force and desperate, starving panic. If Kaelum rode back into the capital with his tiny, exhausted guard, he would be marching directly into a fortified meat grinder. He would be violently butchered before he ever reached the heavy iron gates of the keep, and her life-saving grain would be seized by the exact corrupt lords who had caused the devastating famine in the first place. Kaelum slowly rose to his feet, the freezing rain washing the dark dock grease from his pale, exhausted face. The profound, raw reverence he had shown Lyra only moments ago was completely replaced by a dark, suffocating shroud of complete agonizing acceptance. He was a powerful alpha king bred for violent battle, and his dying kingdom was violently calling him home to die. He did not roar in blind rage or demand that her elite mercenaries march with him to fight his impossible war. He knew the strict terms of their signed contract. She was a merchant, not a battlefield commander, and he would absolutely not ask her to risk her beautiful, flawless empire to save his broken, bleeding crown. He turned to his loyal, exhausted men, shouting rapid, grim orders to mount their horses and prepare for an immediate suicidal ride back to the crumbling capital. Lyra watched his massive back turn away from her, a sudden sharp absolute panic flaring deeply in her chest. For 3 agonizing years, she had meticulously built a massive, impenetrable iron wall around her heart, perfectly designed to keep this exact, arrogant, reckless alpha behavior out. She had sworn to never again rely on the violent, unpredictable fate of an arrogant king. But as she watched him calmly prepare to throw his life away in a senseless, bloody slaughter, she realized she was no longer the fragile, terrified Omega shivering in the muddy slums. She was the omnipotent silver merchant, and she absolutely refused to let a useless, corrupt aristocrat like Lord Valerius destroy the man who had just humbled himself entirely before her feet. Kaelum walked back over to her, his heavy boots splashing in the deep, freezing puddles. He looked down at her striking snow-white hair and her cold, beautiful face, committing every flawless detail to his memory. His dark eyes were filled with a profound, heartbreaking sorrow, completely stripped of his former toxic pride. He told her in a low, rough whisper that she was the most brilliant, peerless queen the world had ever seen, and his greatest eternal regret was realizing it far too late. He gently ordered her to keep the massive iron silos closed, to keep her sprawling city safe, and to let his corrupt kingdom fall into the dark ashes where it truly belonged. He turned his broad, massive shoulders, preparing to mount his warhorse and ride into the freezing, deadly night. But Lyra did not step back into the safety of her high walls. Her chocolate brown eyes hardened with a terrifying, cold, absolute authority. The time for silent ledgers and hidden shadow trades was officially over, and she was about to show the Alpha King exactly how a true master architect wages a brutal war. Lyra stepped forward, her small boots splashing heavily in the freezing mud. She reached out, her delicate fingers wrapping tightly around the thick, wet leather reins of his massive warhorse, halting his forward momentum. Kaelum looked down at her fragile hand, his dark eyes confused by her sudden, unexpected interference. She did not raise her voice to compete with the howling storm, but her tone was absolute and unyielding. She told him that he was an absolute fool if he thought she would let him ride into a senseless, bloody slaughter, just to satisfy his toxic, archaic alpha pride. She ordered him to step away from the panicked horse and follow her back into the grand counting room, because true wars were no longer fought with heavy iron swords. Kaelum hesitated for a fraction of a second, his deeply ingrained military instincts screaming at him to ride out and violently defend his crumbling throne. But the sheer terrifying authority radiating from her small freezing frame completely overpowered his lifelong royal conditioning. He dropped the heavy leather reins, completely surrendering his doomed fate to her brilliant strategic mind. He followed her back through the towering iron doors of the fortress, escaping the punishing freezing rain and the chaotic noise of the docks. Lyra did not stop to dry her soaked dark wool coat or brush the wet snow-white hair from her pale face. She marched directly up the wide, sweeping staircase, her brilliant mind rapidly calculating a flawless, devastating economic trap. She threw open the heavy, reinforced oak doors of the grand counting room, marching straight toward the massive, detailed map of the capital city pinned across the far stone wall. Kaelum stood a few paces behind her, watching in profound, silent awe as she seamlessly transitioned from a shivering Omega into a terrifying, omnipotent general. She pointed her slender, perfectly steady finger at the towering obsidian keep where Lady Vespera and Lord Valerius had barricaded themselves. She calmly explained to the massive Alpha King that wealthy aristocrats never actually fought their own brutal battle. They relied entirely on hired mercenary factions and heavily bribed royal guards to execute their violent treason, and those ruthless mercenaries fought exclusively for heavy silver and solid gold. Lyra walked gracefully over to her heavy mahogany desk, opening a locked hidden iron drawer and pulling out a massive black leather ledger bound in thick steel. She flipped it open, revealing hundreds of complex, highly detailed financial transactions. She looked up at Kaelum, her chocolate brown eyes gleaming with a cold, lethal brilliance that entirely captivated his exhausted soul. She told him that for the past 3 agonizing years, she had not just been stockpiling life-saving. She had been quietly, meticulously buying the massive hidden debts of every single corrupt aristocratic family in the capital city. Lord Valerius believed he possessed vast, untouchable stolen wealth, but his massive sprawling estates were entirely financed by the anonymous shadow banks of Oakhaven. Kaelum stared down at the heavy black ledger, a deep, terrifying realization slowly dawning in his exhausted mind. He realized with a sudden breathtaking shock that Lyra literally owned the very ground the corrupt lords were standing on. She did not need to violently breach the heavy iron gates of the keep with a massive wooden battering ram. She could simply legally foreclose on the entire corrupt kingdom. Lyra picked up her sharp quill, dipping it into the dark black ink, her mind completely devoid of any hesitant fear. She explained her master strategy with absolute chilling precision. She was going to instantly freeze every single financial asset belonging to the rebellious families, locking away their entirely stolen wealth. She would then send a rapid coded message through her vast unseen intelligence network directly to the heavily armed mercenary factions guarding the capital walls. The precise mathematical message would absolutely prove that Lord Valerius was completely bankrupt and could never pay their promised bounties. Furthermore, she would offer those exact same mercenaries a massive, immediate double payment entirely in solid, unyielding Oakhaven gold, if they simply laid down their heavy weapons and securely locked the corrupt aristocrats inside the high stone keep. She was going to completely starve the violent rebellion of its vital financial oxygen before a single drop of innocent blood could ever be spilled. Kaelum watched her rapidly draft the devastating financial orders, his chest heaving with a profound, entirely consuming worship. He had spent his entire brutal life studying ancient military tactics, learning exactly how to crush his enemies on open, bloody battlefields. But standing in the quiet golden light of the counting room, he finally truly understood that the absolute most lethal weapon in the entire world was a brilliant, underestimated Omega holding a simple sharpened quill. Lyra finished writing the complex financial directives, her small hand moving with a flawless, terrifying speed. She handed the heavy sealed parchments to her elite shadow runners, standing silently by the door, ordering them to ride out immediately using the hidden subterranean route. As the rapid runners sprinted into the dark, freezing night, Lyra slowly turned back to face the exhausted, massive Alpha King. The flawless, unbreakable economic trap was completely set and permanently sealed. The arrogant, corrupt lords in the distant capital were currently drinking stolen sweet wine and celebrating their violent treason, entirely unaware that the invisible, fragile girl they had so callously thrown into the freezing mud was about to erase their ancient, powerful bloodlines with a single effortless stroke of black ink. Kaelum took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the heavy, intoxicating tension returning rapidly to the quiet room, but this time it was laced with the terrifying, thrilling anticipation of their impending absolute, total victory. The morning sun rose over the jagged eastern mountains, casting a pale light across the valley of Oakhaven. Lyra stood perfectly still by the massive arched window of the grand counting room, holding a steaming porcelain cup of dark, bitter tea. She did not sleep a single hour during the long, freezing night. Her brilliant mind was entirely occupied tracing the rapidly moving threads of her sprawling merchant network. The heavy sealed parchments she dispatched hours ago were currently triggering a massive chain reaction across the entire continent. She imagined the silent riders slipping seamlessly through the hidden subterranean tunnels beneath the capital, bypassing the heavily fortified gates and the royal guards. The trap she had meticulously designed for 3 agonizing years was finally snapping shut with flawless, terrifying. She took a slow, calming sip, feeling a profound sense of absolute control settling firmly into her aching bones. She was no longer a victim of cruel aristocratic whims. She was the undisputed master of their economic destruction. Hundreds of miles away in the starving capital, the flawless execution of her master plan began precisely at the sounding of the morning bells. The massive hidden gears of her shadow empire turned violently, grinding the arrogant rebellion into fine dust. The sprawling, lavish estates of Lord Valerius and the corrupt nobility were surrounded by high, ornate iron fences designed to keep the starving commoners out. But those expensive fences could not stop the devastating financial siege. The heavily loaded merchant wagons that usually delivered their imported sweet wines, rich meats, and winter firewood simply stopped arriving. The silent network of Beta and Omega laborers who maintained their massive manors abruptly dropped their tools and vanished seamlessly into the chaotic lower districts. Lyra had ordered a total, uncompromising embargo. The aristocratic families were instantly cut off from the vital supply chains they had so arrogantly taken for granted. They were suddenly trapped in their own cold, dark mansions, isolated from the bleeding kingdom they sought to rule. Deep within the secure lower levels of the capital, the heavy iron vaults of the shadow banks were violently locked and permanently sealed. The corrupt lords had heavily leveraged their ancient family names, borrowing massive sums of hidden silver from anonymous foreign lenders to fund their luxurious lifestyles and their treasonous coup. They completely failed to realize that every single anonymous lender was Lyra. With a single devastating stroke of her quill, she had legally instantly frozen every financial asset they possessed. When the arrogant noblemen sent their loyal servants to withdraw the heavy silver needed to pay the restless armed mercenary factions guarding the keep, they found only locked iron doors and cold silent clerks. The massive untouchable wealth of the highest aristocracy evaporated, completely erased by the flawless mathematical genius of the silver merchant. King Kaelum stood near the heavy mahogany desk, watching the continuous influx of intelligence reports arriving via breathless shadow runners. He read the short-coded messages detailing the total bloodless collapse of the violent rebellion. He looked up from the heavy parchment, his dark eyes fixed completely on the fragile striking Omega standing calmly by the window. He felt a terrifying awe radiating through his massive chest, completely shattering the remaining fragments of his toxic alpha pride. He had spent his entire brutal life believing that absolute power was measured by the violent swing of a broadsword. But Lyra was effortlessly conquering his heavily fortified capital without spilling a single drop of human blood. She was starving the rebellion of its financial oxygen, slowly asphyxiating the corrupt lords with their crippling debt. The final devastating phase of the flawless economic trap was entirely focused on the heavy obsidian keep itself. A breathless scout burst into the counting room, handing Lyra a small piece of dark red parchment. She unrolled it, her chocolate brown eyes scanning the precise message. A slow, chilling smile ghosted across her pale, beautiful face. She looked across the quiet room at the massive Alpha King, her voice dropping to a dangerous, thrilling whisper. She told him that the elite mercenary factions guarding Lady Vespera had just received their heavy Oakhaven gold. The ruthless hired killers immediately turned on their bankrupt aristocratic masters, securely locking the heavy iron doors of the high keep from the outside. The rebellion was completely trapped inside the cold stone fortress, with absolutely no food or hope of rescue. Lyra set her fragile teacup down on the polished marble sill, her brilliant mind fully shifting to the final devastating confrontation. She commanded Kaelum to prepare his massive warhorse, because it was finally time for the silver merchant to ride into the dying capital and collect her kingdom. The journey back to the capital city was starkly different from Kaelum's desperate, grueling march just a week prior. This time he did not ride at the head of a starving, exhausted procession. He rode a half-step behind the massive, heavy reinforced carriage of the silver merchant, entirely surrounded by her elite, heavily armed guards. The sprawling convoy was a terrifying, beautiful display of absolute logistical dominance, stretching for miles across the frozen southern plains. Hundreds of massive transport wagons rolled steadily forward, loaded with thousands of tons of life-saving winter wheat, dried meats, and clean fresh water. Lyra sat inside the dark velvet interior of her carriage, her chocolate brown eyes fixed calmly on the rapidly approaching horizon. She was returning to the exact place that had violently rejected her, but she felt absolutely no lingering fear. Her brilliant mind was entirely focused on the final mathematical calculations required to completely restructure the broken, dying city. As the massive convoy approached the towering iron gates of the capital, a profound, heavy silence hung over the sprawling valley. There were no deafening war horns, no chaotic clashes of heavy steel broadswords, and absolutely no bloody, brutal battlefield. The devastating economic siege had been entirely bloodless and flawlessly effective. The massive iron portcullis that had violently slammed shut behind her 3 agonizing years ago was now raised completely open. The heavily armored mercenary captains who had been hired by Lord Valerius to slaughter the king stood perfectly still, lining the wide cobblestone avenue. As Lyra's carriage rolled slowly through the towering gates, the ruthless, hardened killers immediately dropped to a single knee, bowing their heads in deep, absolute reverence. They did not bow to the massive Alpha King riding his towering warhorse. They bowed entirely to the peerless, fragile Omega, who held the heavy ironclad ledgers and the absolute control of their massive wealth. Kaelum watched the breathtaking display of absolute submission, his dark eyes wide with a profound, entirely consuming awe. He looked at the towering obsidian keep in the center of the capital. The high-born, corrupt aristocrats who had arrogantly orchestrated the violent treason were entirely broken. Starved of their luxurious imported supplies and completely stripped of their massive stolen wealth, they had surrendered in a matter of days. Lord Valerius and Lady Vespera were currently securely locked inside the cold stone fortress, reduced to desperate, pathetic prisoners in their own lavish home. Kaelum realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that if he had aggressively charged the capital with his elite vanguard, thousands of innocent, loyal men would have died screaming in the freezing mud. Lyra had flawlessly, effortlessly achieved a total, absolute victory without sacrificing a single beating heart. The massive, heavy convoy came to a slow, deliberate halt in the center of the Grand Royal Square. Thousands of starving, desperate citizens crept slowly out of the dark, ruined lower districts, their hollow eyes completely wide as they stared at the massive mountains of light. Lyra stepped gracefully out of her carriage, the cold morning wind catching her striking snow-white hair. She did not look at the towering royal keep or the defeated aristocratic prisoners. She looked directly at the fragile, suffering commoners, her chocolate brown eyes filled with a deep, fierce, protective warmth. She raised a single delicate hand, signaling her beta foreman to immediately begin the massive organized distribution of the heavy grain sacks. The chaotic, starving city instantly began to heal under her absolute, flawless command. Kaelum slowly dismounted his massive warhorse, his heavy leather boots hitting the polished cobblestones. He walked deliberately toward her, completely ignoring the stunned whispers of his He stopped just inches away from her small, fragile frame, his broad, muscular shoulders entirely relaxed. He looked down at the brilliant, beautiful woman who had completely conquered his dying world with a sharpened quill and a heavy leather. He felt a deep, terrifyingly beautiful warmth flood his exhausted chest, completely incinerating the last toxic remnants of his dark alpha pride. He slowly dropped to one single knee in the exact center of the bustling public square, directly in front of the massive, starving crowds. He bowed his dark head, his deep, rough voice echoing clearly over the chaotic noise of the busy square. He completely submitted his ancient royal authority, acknowledging her not merely as his equal, but as the true, undisputed, supreme architect of the entire realm. He swore a profound, unbreakable oath to forever protect her brilliant mind, with his physical strength completely surrendering his massive beating heart to the fragile Omega he had once thrown away into the dark, freezing shadows. The massive obsidian doors of the Grand Hall groaned heavily as they were pushed open, not by royal guards but by Lyra's elite mercenaries clad in dark steel. Lyra stepped across the threshold, her silver-heeled boots clicking sharply against the polished black marble. 3 agonizing years ago, this exact room had been a suffocating nightmare of collective aristocratic disgust and crushing humiliation. Now it was merely an empty, echoing chamber waiting to be completely repurposed. The cavernous space was completely stripped of its former golden warmth. The high crystal chandeliers hung dark and unlit, casting long, terrifying shadows across the empty royal dais. Lyra walked slowly down the center aisle, her striking snow-white hair gleaming like a polished beacon in the dim light. She did not tremble, and her chocolate brown eyes held absolutely no lingering terror. She was not the fragile, broken Omega who had run blindly into the freezing rain. She was the omnipotent master architect returning to completely dismantle the rotten foundation of the dying king. King Kaelum walked a half-step behind her, his massive broad shoulders relaxed, his dark eyes entirely focused on her back. He was a silent, towering mountain of lethal physical protection, entirely submitted to her brilliant mind. At the far end of the long, grand hall, kneeling on the cold marble floor, at the base of the empty obsidian throne, were Lord Valerius and Lady Vespera. The high-born, corrupt aristocrats looked entirely pathetic, completely stripped of their stolen radiant luxury. Vespera's heavy crimson velvet dress was heavily stained and wrinkled, her stolen sparkling diamonds looking cheap and utterly useless in the cold, dim light. Her father, Lord Valerius, was trembling violently, his pale face flushed with a chaotic mixture of desperate panic and lingering toxic arrogance. They had been dragged from their locked, frozen estate by the exact same mercenary factions they had attempted to heavily bribe. As Lyra approached them, she felt a deep, profound silence settle completely over her heavily guarded heart. She did not feel a burning, chaotic rage or a desperate, petty need for violent physical revenge. She looked down at the shivering, miserable nobles and simply saw a fundamentally flawed mathematical equation that she was finally going to permanently erase from the world. Lord Valerius violently raised his trembling head, his voice a high-pitched, desperate screech, echoing through the cold, cavernous hall. He demanded that Kaelum immediately execute the filthy slum rat and restore the ancient inherited rights of the noble bloodlines. He arrogantly screamed that the kingdom could never survive without the protective wealth and deep historical pedigree of the highest aristocracy. Lyra did not look to Kaelum for physical protection or emotional validation. She did not raise her voice to match the pathetic, screaming lord. She simply reached out a delicate hand, taking a heavy black leather ledger from the mercenary captain standing silently beside her. She tossed the thick steel-bound book onto the polished black marble floor directly in front of the trembling aristocrats. The heavy thud echoed loudly, violently, slicing through the arrogant screeching of the broken lord. Lyra spoke, her voice a cold, beautiful symphony of absolute, unyielding logic. She informed Lord Valerius that his ancient inherited wealth was a complete fabricated illusion. She explicitly detailed the massive hidden debts he had recklessly accumulated over the past 3 decades, outlining exactly how he had systematically starved the lower districts to fund his extravagant, useless vanity. She pointed a slender, perfectly manicured finger at the heavy ledger, stating with chilling precision that she owned every single acre of his sprawling agricultural estates, every single brick of his towering, heavily fortified mansion, and the very expensive silk clothes currently hanging on his shivering back. She told him that he was no longer a powerful lord of the realm. He was a completely bankrupt, desperate tenant, living entirely by her strictly regulated mercy. Lady Vespera let out a sudden chaotic sob, her hollow eyes wide with absolute sheer disbelief. She looked frantically up at Kaelum, desperately begging the massive Alpha King to honor their royal mating ceremony and brutally strike down the arrogant Omega. Kaelum looked down at the weeping highborn lady, completely disgusted by her empty, pathetic vanity. He stated in a low, dangerous rumble that the only true queen in the entire room was the brilliant woman standing beside him, and their fake, politically motivated mating ceremony was permanently, violently annulled. Lyra watched the last fragile remnants of aristocratic illusion completely shatter into fine dust. She had perfectly executed her flawless economic trap, rendering the most dangerous, violent threats entirely powerless without lifting a single heavy blade. She leaned slightly forward, her chocolate brown eyes locking onto Lord Valerius, delivering her final devastating ultimatum. She told him he had exactly 1 hour to sign a full absolute confession of his violent treason against the crown, or she would open the heavy iron gates of his estate and let the thousands of starving, desperate citizens he had personally oppressed decide his final bloody fate. Lord Valerius stared up at her, his face entirely drained of color, his arrogant spirit completely violently broken, leaving a heavy, terrifying silence that hung in the air, demanding Kaelum's final, ultimate royal judgment. The heavy obsidian doors of the grand hall were pulled entirely open, allowing the cold, crisp afternoon air to finally sweep through the stale, suffocating chill. Lord Valerius and Lady Vespera were violently hauled away by the dark armored mercenaries, their pathetic, desperate sobs echoing faintly down the long stone corridors until they were completely swallowed by the massive fortress. They were no longer dangerous political threats. They were permanently erased from the grand equation of power, stripped of their stolen lands and their ancient bloated titles. Lyra watched them disappear, feeling a profound, heavy silence settle over the cavernous room. The terrifying ghosts of her past, the cruel, arrogant faces that had once haunted her darkest, freezing nightmares in the muddy slums were completely gone. She had fundamentally, permanently rewritten the rigid, toxic laws of survival, not by adopting their brutal, violent methods, but by elevating her own brilliant mind into an absolute, untouchable weapon. King Kaelum stepped slowly into her peripheral vision, his massive physical presence no longer an intimidating threat, but a steady, unyielding anchor. He gently reached out, his callous, scarred fingers lightly brushing against the sleeve of her dark midnight wool coat. He did not issue a loud, booming command or drag her to the royal dais. He softly asked her to walk with him to the high marble balcony overlooking the sprawling, bustling royal square. Lyra nodded, her chocolate brown eyes reflecting a quiet, beautiful strength. They walked together out into the bright afternoon sun, the freezing wind immediately catching her striking snow-white hair. Below them, the massive cobblestone square was entirely packed with tens of thousands of common citizens. The desperate, starving people from the lower districts, the exhausted beta laborers, and the forgotten fragile omegas had all gathered to witness the monumental structural shift of their dying world. When they saw Lyra step up to the heavy stone balustrade, a sudden deafening roar of pure, genuine adulation erupted from the massive crowd. They did not cheer for the ancient royal bloodline or the massive, invincible Alpha King. They screamed her anonymous shadow name, praising the brilliant silver merchant who had flawlessly saved their fragile lives from the dark, creeping famine. Kaelum stood a half step behind her, feeling the immense, overwhelming wave of public worship washing over his broad shoulders. He looked down at the massive sea of hopeful faces, realizing with deep, agonizing clarity that he had completely failed them. He had spent his entire reign building massive stone walls and violent military campaigns, entirely neglecting the vulnerable, beating heart of his own kingdom. He slowly stepped forward, standing directly beside the beautiful, omnipotent woman who had completely conquered his ignorance. He raised his massive, calloused hand, commanding a sudden, heavy, respectful silence over the sprawling plaza. The deafening cheers slowly faded, leaving only the soft whisper of the freezing wind blowing through the towering iron banners. Kaelum did not project his voice with the aggressive, demanding roar of a terrifying alpha. He spoke with a deep, raw, heartbreaking vulnerability that carried effortlessly across the silent square. He publicly addressed the massive crowd, confessing his monumental, catastrophic failures without a single shred of defense of royal pride. He admitted that he had been blinded by toxic ancient traditions and arrogant physical vanity. He told them that 3 agonizing years ago, he had callously banished the most brilliant, peerless mind the world had ever produced, plunging the entire realm into a dark, desperate suffering. He turned his heavy, massive frame away from the massive crowd, looking directly down into Lyra's wide, chocolate brown eyes. He did not apologize to her as a supreme sovereign granting a minor royal pardon. He apologized as a completely humbled, broken man desperately begging for her ultimate grace. He told her that she was the absolute, magnificent architect of his salvation, the profound, beautiful light that had entirely shattered his dark, arrogant ignorance. His deep, rough voice trembled with a raw, pure emotion, completely laying his entire powerful soul bare before the whole world. Kaelum slowly reached into his heavy dark wool tunic, pulling out a simple, elegant circlet, forged entirely of dark, unyielding iron and polished silver. It was not a heavy, gaudy crown, covered in stolen bloody diamonds. It was a flawless, beautiful reflection of her own industrial empire. He dropped slowly to one single knee on the cold white marble floor of the balcony, completely ignoring the massive audible gasp of pure shock rippling through the tens of thousands of citizens below. An invincible Alpha King never bowed to a fragile Omega. But Kaelum was no longer blindly following the toxic, rigid laws of the past. He gently raised the beautiful iron circlet, placing it softly upon her striking snow-white hair. He declared her the supreme equal ruler of the massive realm, formally transferring the absolute structural control of the kingdom into her brilliant, capable hands. Lyra looked down at the massive, powerful man kneeling willingly at her feet, her heavily guarded heart finally completely breaking open. The cold, impenetrable iron walls she had meticulously built to survive the freezing slums slowly melted away, replaced by a profound, deep, consuming warmth. She reached out her small, delicate hands, gently cupping his rough, scarred face. She felt the heavy, powerful beating of his massive heart syncing perfectly with her own steady rhythm. She was no longer the invisible, terrified girl running blindly into the dark, freezing rain. She was the absolute, undisputed queen of a brilliant new world built on pure, undeniable intellect and earned mutual respect. She pulled him gently to his feet, the massive crowd below erupting into a deafening, joyful symphony as the new flawless era of absolute equality finally beautifully began. The seasonal change brought a crisp, clear spring to the capital city, stripping away the dark, heavy remnants of the freezing winter famine. Lyra sat at the center of a massive circular table she had personally designed to replace the towering, intimidating royal dais in the grand hall. The circular design was a silent, powerful statement of absolute structural equality, ensuring that no individual could ever sit above another based on their birth or biological caste. For the past 3 months, her brilliant mind had been entirely focused on a massive legal overhaul of the entire realm. She dipped her sharp quill into a deep well of black ink, her chocolate brown eyes scanning the thick rolls of new parchment spread across the smooth oak surface. She was systematically, ruthlessly tearing down the ancient, archaic caste system that had violently oppressed her people for centuries. She struck a thick, bold line through the old royal decrees that dictated an Omega's permanent submissive placement in society. Under her new flawless legal framework, individual worth was no longer measured by the toxic random luck of secondary gender dynamics or the stolen wealth of an ancestral bloodline. It was measured entirely by intellect, hard work, and practical contribution to the realm. King Kaelum sat directly beside her, his massive frame relaxed, his dark eyes watching her every movement with a profound, consuming adoration. He did not interfere or try to assert his former alpha dominance over her legislative decisions. He had completely, permanently abandoned his absolute royal veto, choosing instead to become the ultimate loyal guardian of her vision. Whenever a lingering conservative nobleman attempted to voice a sharp, arrogant protest against the radical new laws, Kaelum would simply lock his heavy jaw and cast a cold, dangerous warning look across the room, instantly silencing the opposition with his restrained, lethal presence. He was no longer a tyrant forcing his people into bloody submission. He was the heavy iron shield protecting the fragile, beautiful genesis of a fair, equal society. Lyra felt a deep, steady warmth blooming in her chest every time he quietly moved a heavy ledger closer to her hand or poured her a fresh cup of hot herbal tea. He was actively learning the complex, silent language of her mind, proving with every quiet gesture that he valued her far beyond the physical boundaries of a biological bond. The new laws immediately transformed the daily life of the entire kingdom. The sprawling lower districts, once a dark, muddy maze of starvation and desperate fear, were rapidly evolving into vibrant, humming centers of commerce and industrial education. Lyra established vast public registries where any citizen, regardless of whether they were a beta, an omega, or a penniless alpha, could pitch strategic trade ideas, apply for specialized logistical training, or secure small financial loans directly from the new royal treasury. The rigid walls that had kept the vulnerable citizens trapped in the gutters were completely demolished. The capital city was no longer a silent, grim fortress of pale stone and archaic tradition. It rang out with the loud, rhythmic sounds of busy hammers, moving wagons, and people actively collaborating based on shared merit and mutual respect. The commoners were no longer invisible ghosts. They were the active, brilliant architects of their own future. As the final twilight of the evening fell, casting a soft, golden-purple glow across the peaceful city, the bustling grand hall finally emptied out. The heavy administrative clerks packed away their ledgers, leaving Lyra and Kaelum entirely alone in the quiet, cavernous space. The soft, flickering light of a few remaining candles cast long, gentle shadows across the circular table. Lyra let out a long, slow breath, setting her quill down and rubbing her tired eyes. She felt a profound physical exhaustion washing over her, but her heart was lighter than it had ever been. Suddenly, she felt two massive warm hands gently rest upon her tense shoulders. Kaelum leaned down, his deep, rough voice, a soft, beautiful whisper near her ear, asking her to step away from the heavy paperwork for just a single night. He guided her gently to her feet, turning her small, fragile frame until she was looking directly up into his intense, dark eyes. The slow burn romance that had been carefully, meticulously earned through shared labor, intense respect, and the slow healing of deep emotional wounds was finally reaching its beautiful culmination. Kaelum looked down at her striking snow-white hair and her beautiful face, his chest heaving with a raw, consuming emotion. He did not look at her with a fleeting primal hunger. He looked at her with a profound, reverent worship that completely laid his powerful soul bare. He gently reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her pale cheek with a breathtaking tenderness. He told her in a rough, emotional whisper that she had not just saved his dying kingdom from a physical famine, she had saved him from the dark, empty void of his own arrogant ignorance. Lyra looked up into his eyes, her chocolate brown gaze melting completely under his intense heat. The final lingering fragments of her protective iron walls crumbled into dust. She realized she no longer needed to hide behind strict numbers or cold contracts to keep her heart safe from him. He had stripped away his heavy crown, his toxic pride, and his entire royal identity just to stand beside her as a humble equal partner. She slowly raised her delicate hands, wrapping her fingers gently around his thick neck, pulling him down toward her. When his warm lips finally met hers, it was a profound, beautiful collision of two souls that had survived the absolute darkest storms of life to find their perfect, steady equilibrium. The kiss was slow, deep, and intensely emotional, a sacred, silent covenant, forged not by mystical fate or ancient bloodlines, but by a profound choice to love, honor, and protect each other as absolute equals. They stood locked in each other's arms, in the center of the transformed Grand Hall, completely ready to step forward together into a bright, limitless future. 10 long, peaceful years had passed since the heavy obsidian doors of the Grand Hall were finally thrown open to welcome the brilliant dawn of a completely new era. Lyra stood on the high white marble balcony, her delicate hands resting gently on the warm stone balustrade. She looked out over a sprawling capital city that was completely unrecognizable from the dark, freezing nightmare she had once known. The muddy, terrifying, freezing slums of the lower districts were entirely gone, replaced by wide, pristine cobblestone avenues lined with bustling commercial markets and bright, beautiful homes. Towering wooden windmills and massive iron water wheels turned steadily in the eastern river, providing endless clean energy and fresh water to every single citizen, regardless of their biological caste. The heavy, choking smog of desperate survival had been entirely, completely replaced by the warm, sweet, fragrant scent of bloom. Directly below the high marble balconies sat the magnificent, shining jewel of her vast architectural legacy. It was not a violent military fortress or a dark, towering dungeon. It was a sprawling, open academy of commerce, trade, and advanced logistics. Thousands of bright, young, eager Beta and Omega students walked freely through the beautiful open courtyards, carrying heavy leather ledgers and complex architectural blueprints. They were no longer invisible, frightened citizens forced to hide in the dark shadows. They were proud, brilliant, respected scholars, entirely protected by the new, unyielding laws of the realm. Lyra had meticulously built a massive sanctuary of human intellect, ensuring with absolute certainty that no young, fragile Omega would ever again be thrown into the freezing rain or told they possessed absolutely no inherent value. The ancient, archaic, violent monarchy had been completely, permanently dissolved. They genuinely believed the unified voice of the common people was absolutely paramount. In its place, Lyra and Kaelum had established a massive equal council where representatives from every single district, every trade guild, and every biological caste gathered to debate and construct the future of the kingdom. The heavy golden crowns and stolen sparkling diamonds had been completely melted down into raw liquid currency to fund massive public libraries and regional hospitals. True ultimate power was no longer inherited through arrogant ancient bloodline. It was actively, continuously earned through profound public service and brilliant logistical innovation. A sudden, bright, beautiful burst of joyful laughter pulled Lyra's attention away from the bustling city below. She slowly turned her head, her chocolate brown eyes softening with a deep, profound maternal warmth. In the center of the royal gardens, Kaelum was sitting on the soft green grass, his massive broad shoulders completely relaxed. He was not teaching a terrified young prince how to aggressively swing a heavy iron broadsword or violently conquer a weaker enemy. He was incredibly patiently, carefully teaching their twin 7-year-old heirs, a young alpha boy and a young omega girl, how to calculate the complex mathematical displacement of a heavy river barge. The invincible Alpha King, whose name had once struck absolute terror across the continent, was now a gentle, devoted father, proudly watching his young children master The profound, quiet, beautiful power of a sharpened quill. Kaelum looked up, his intense dark eyes catching Lyra's gaze across the bright, sunlit garden. He offered her a deeply warm, breathtaking smile that completely entirely belonged only to her. He slowly, gracefully rose to his feet, brushing the soft grass from his simple linen tunic, and walked gracefully up the marble stairs to stand directly beside her. He gently wrapped a massive warm arm around her small, delicate waist, pulling her gently against his strong, protective side. They stood completely together in absolute perfect silence, looking out over the incredible, magnificent empire they had built completely from the ashes of arrogant ignorance. Lyra rested her snow-white head against his broad chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his... Because she had started her journey as an invisible, humiliated Omega, desperately running for her life in the freezing mud. But completely through pure, unyielding intellect, undeniable resilience, and a profound earned love, she had completely rewritten. She had successfully built an unbreakable hidden empire and transformed it entirely into a brilliant, lasting paradise. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you. Disclaimer: this video is a work of fiction, created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, settings, and events depicted are entirely imaginary and are not intended to represent real-life people or situations. Please view for entertainment purposes only.